Lives Matter is winning, and they don't need advice from the liberal establishment. By Keaton Weiss of Due Dissidents. Polling indicates that 74% of Americans believe that George Floyd's death is a symptom of a broader systemic racial injustice. In a separate poll, that same percentage support the massive protest movement that arose in the aftermath of his horrific murder. By a 2-to-1 margin, Americans are more upset by the police's actions in the Floyd case than they are by the violent incidents that have occurred at some of the protests since. A recent Yahoo News YouGov poll shows that Black Lives Matter now has the support of 57% of the public, including 55% of independents and even 27% of Republicans. Simply put, an overwhelming majority of Americans now acknowledge the reality of institutionalized racism and support the mass movement to overthrow it. Out of this sweeping and spontaneous uprising, a political demand has emerged: defund the police. The thinking behind this is fairly simple. Police budgets should be substantially reduced, and the savings should be reallocated in ways that help people with problems that too often we rely upon police to manage. These could include on-call mental health specialists, drug abuse intervention professionals, unarmed city employees to issue citations for minor traffic-related violations, and of course increased funding for other social programs, housing, infrastructure, etc. Nothing too complicated. In fact, all of that fits beautifully into this nifty little infographic. Defund the police. We ask too much of them. Mental health responders trained in de-escalation on call at all times. Easy and discreet access to domestic abuse intervention specialists. Money to assist, feed, and house the homeless. Unarmed city employees to spot and resolve road hazards, i.e. broken taillights. Specialized substance abuse intervention professionals, and investment in drug rehabilitation rather than punishment. Black Lives Matter. So in just the past 2 weeks, we saw a horrific police murder inspire a mass movement of engaged citizens who took to the streets, and out of that movement, a solution has been proposed. In the beginning, calls to defund police departments were met surprisingly warmly. Mainstream publications like The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and The New York Times all published stories and podcasts sympathetic to the idea. But then, of course, as often happens, the right voiced their opposition and the liberals got scared and backed down. Curse you, Tucker Carlson! Liberals and Democrats, as opposed to progressives, I assume, are now concerned that calls to defund the police will hand a political victory to the conservatives and perhaps to provide a boost to Donald Trump, whose re-election prospects have been dwindling, largely because his overtly fascistic response to these very protests. They worry that defund the police is either too vague, too radical, or both. I think they're only pretending that it's too vague. The powers are probably concerned that the money train's wheels might come off. There's a hell of a lot of profit to be made by the police industrial complex that won't be made if we don't have a police industrial complex. Make no mistake, without the police industrial complex, the prison industrial complex is not going to survive very well. Scores of articles have appeared in recent days that attempt to explain what defunding the police would actually mean. None are any better than the infographic above. The Atlantic's new piece on this matter is titled Unbundle the Police, and the Washington Post published an op-ed on June 11th called Don't Defund the Police, Reimagine the Police. The American Women's Coalition came up with a meme of their own, which has been making the rounds in nervous white liberal social media circles. Nervous white liberals, I love that. They crossed out defund the police and said, let's transform the police, reform the police, rebuild the police, retrain the police, and reprioritize investments into education, healthcare, mental health services, and other community programs. But we must stop saying defund the police. Yep, they sound nervous to me. I really think they're worried about profit loss. Slogans matter. This toxic phrase might have good intentions. Toxic phrase. Defund the police. You can tell when liberals don't like something because they immediately call it toxic. This toxic phrase might have good intentions behind it, but it makes most people think, we can speak for most people, we privileged Karen types, but it makes most people think we want to abolish or shrink police forces way down and let criminals run wild. I don't know, as I was reading that list, reform the police, rebuild the police, retrain the police, I kept thinking, abolish the police, abolish the police, abolish the police. Don't defund the police, just exterminate them. But no, that sounds too toxic for them. We are damaging the BLM cause. Oh yeah, what do you know about it, you white Karen? We are damaging the BLM cause and harming our chances of beating Trump in November. Okay, that's what it's about. By alienating the majority of white centrist liberals with a misleading slogan that the right wing uses to make people afraid. Headlines matter. Most people never learn the details, they just react to slogans and headlines, like vote blue no matter who, that one, right? Let's be smart and use winning slogans that bring more people on board, not phrases that confuse people and scare them away. No, confusing people is what you want to do. How else are you going to get them to vote for Joe Biden? So on the topic of vagueness, let's stop and ask ourselves which of these messages is actually the least vague. Unbundle the police, reimagine the police, transform the police, or defund the police. I still am kind of leaning towards abolish or exterminate the police. The answer is obvious, and at the risk of further confusing the liberal hand-wringers, pearl clutchers, the reason defund is the clearest of those messages is precisely because it's the most radical. It's unafraid, uncorrupted, and undiluted. It's not pretending to be anything other than what it is, which makes it by far the easiest message to understand, and apparently the most threatening because of that. I'm reminded of a great moment in the July 31st Democratic primary debate in which Kamala Harris and Joe Biden were trading barbs over their moderate, incremental, and mostly incomprehensible healthcare plans. When the moderator threw to New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio, he said, speaking for almost everyone in the audience, "I don't know what the vice president and the senator are talking about." He then made a very clear and convincing case for Medicare for All, the least vague and of course the most radical of all the plans being discussed. And so the claim that defunding the police is somehow more difficult to wrap one's head around than any of these other ideas being proposed just doesn't pass muster. Now that we've got that cleared up, let's deal with the liberals' actual concern. They're afraid that the Republicans will use this phrase against them. As the above meme from the American Women's Coalition states, they fear that defund the police is a toxic phrase, and that by using it, we're harming our chances of beating Trump. You already destroyed any chances of beating Trump when you cheated Bernie out of the nomination. You should have thought about that before. All you moms for Biden, you should have thought about that before. One of my vote blue no matter who friends, Evan Geronidis, just posted this. Joe Biden leads Trump in the polls for a lot of different reasons. One large one is his support from female voters. Biden is earning a historic amount of support from female voters for a presidential nominee when examining polling over the last 70 years. Take a look at the most recent live interview polls of registered voters from May and June compiled by the New York Times' Nate Cohn. Biden is leading among female registered voters by 59% to 35%, a 25-point margin when the numbers aren't rounded. That's a significant increase from his 19-point advantage earlier this year and the 14-point lead Hillary Clinton had in the final 2016 pre-election polls of registered voters. Clinton had a 13-point edge with likely female voters. And that's after they know he's a rapist. It's ironic. The hypocrisy runs deep with these moms. CNN.com. Joe Biden is winning female voters by a historic margin. Under that article I posted, Biden is worse than Trump. Trump inherited the system. Biden was its architect. By Chris Hedges. Back to Keaton. Shying away from a fight is nothing new for liberals and Democrats, but what makes this instance particularly offensive is that this isn't their fight to shy away from. Since most of them are white, right? Who are they to splain things to the Black Lives Matter movement? This revitalized Black Lives Matter movement, which has accomplished so much in just a matter of days, owes nothing whatsoever to the Democratic Party or the Joe Biden presidential campaign. The truth is, If Democrats' electoral prospects were worth worrying about, the issues being raised by these protesters would have been resolved decades ago, seeing as bloated police budgets, abuse of police power, gutted social safety nets, and grotesque income inequality are all too common in city after city with Democratic mayors, Democratic district attorneys, and Democratic city councils. If anything, this uprising is a response to the failure of the liberal establishment to address the needs of their most loyal and reliable voter base. Ding, ding, ding! Atop the Democratic ticket this fall will be the co-author of the infamous 1994 crime bill, who has already come out as being staunchly opposed to the movement's loudest rallying cry. At this writing, it seems likely that his running mate will be the former Attorney General of California, Kamala, who prosecuted the parents of truant children and later laughed about it in public, but not the white-collar criminal who currently serves as U.S. Treasury Secretary. Mnuchin. She didn't prosecute his bank. This movement is looking to upend the very status quo that's been perpetuated throughout the years by Democratic Party hacks, and so they ought not even consider tweaking their language, diluting their message, or modifying their goals in order to accommodate the Biden campaign or any other Democratic electoral effort. Let it burn, baby. To suggest that they should is to reveal an obnoxious arrogance about where this movement's loyalties ought to lie. It's also woefully misguided in its assessment not only of how today's politics work, but more existentially, what politics are. When it comes to Republicans and Donald Trump weaponizing the phrase, defund the police, that cat is already out of the bag. They're doing it right now, even as Democrats are running from the idea as far and as fast as possible. This should come as no surprise to even the most casual political observer. What Democrats say they're for is always more or less irrelevant to what Republicans say Democrats are for. This cycle, nervous liberals were afraid that nominating Bernie Sanders would invite the GOP to attack them as socialists. Of course, now that Biden is the presumptive nominee, Trump still calls them the radical left Democrats and claims that Biden is being controlled by socialists. In 2018, the Republicans insisted that Democrats were for open borders and abolishing ICE. Facts be damned. They lost that race. In 2004, though, they successfully tarnished John Kerry as the most liberal Democrat in the Senate, despite his insistence to the contrary. And while Kerry reiterated his opposition to gay marriage throughout that campaign, the Bush team was still able to make that election a referendum on moral values, as opposed to the disastrous illegal war of choice that they started. And they won! So you see, win or lose, true or false, the right is going to operate as they always do. They'll paint the Democrats as extreme anti-American commies who want to confiscate people's guns and take from the makers to give to the takers and hope that it sticks. Pete Buttigieg, to his credit, made this exact point quite well in the early days of the campaign before he betrayed all of his supposed principles when he realized there wasn't room for him in the progressive lane. More importantly, though, liberals' rejection of these calls to defund the police reveals their existential misconceptions of politics itself. To the liberal class, politics is a battle of wits that takes place on the pages of the country's newspapers, in the studios of cable TV networks, on the scroll of the Huffington Post and/or the Drudge Report, and then finally on Election Day at the ballot box. If this is your view of what politics is and ought to be, then it makes sense that you'd find it prudent to revise whatever slogans and messages arise from an authentic groundswell of grassroots energy into something more refined, more polished, and more palatable to the broader electorate. This protest movement's views of politics is obviously quite different. They see politics as a battle of strengths that happens mostly in the streets, where direct action is applied to exert maximum pressure on the society and the state in order to push through the urgent reforms that they feel are long past due. And the thing about mass movements like the ones we're seeing now is that they have no editorial boards, no consultants, and no senior advisors. There is no marketing department staffed with experts who pore over data about what exactly the right slogan ought to be. Rather, a slogan, a message, an ethos will organically come together as the movement evolves and expands, which is precisely what's happened here. Therefore, defund the police should be the message because it already is the message. It's the message that arose naturally from a mass mobilization of ordinary people. Is it perfect? No, but it's the most perfect distillation of its spirit that the movement could produce, as evidenced by the fact that it is what the movement produced organically and spontaneously. And remember, this movement in just 2 weeks has already been far more effective in moving the needle on public opinion than these liberal pearl clutchers have been in the past 40 years. Black Lives Matter's approval numbers have doubled since 2016. New polling shows that 76% of Americans view racism as a big problem, including 71% of white people, up an astounding 26 points from only 5 years ago. These shifts in attitudes have also made themselves felt throughout the culture. Cops is canceled. The Confederate flag is banned at NASCAR events. Even the NFL has issued an apology for not listening to peaceful protests. Polling does indicate, to be fair, that defunding the police is not popular at the moment. It polls at a mere 27% approval to 57% disapproval. Not surprisingly, though, when the question is asked of whether or not people approve of budgeting less money for their local police department and more for social services, 44% approve and only 41% disapprove. And that is what defunding the police actually means. Now, of course, the liberal reads this and says, aha, see? When we explain it better and don't use such a toxic phrase, the people agree with us. So let's just dump the phrase. But we should remind them that, as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez recently tweeted, not long ago, Black Lives Matter was also a rallying cry for justice that politicians worried polled too poorly, was too divisive, and required too much explanation. As a matter of fact, Black Lives Matter's approval rating 4 short years ago was 27%, the exact same as today's defund the police slogan. Today that number has doubled, not because they wavered and moderated, but because they held strong and let society catch up with them. And they should do the same now. And whatever short-term electoral risks they pose to the Democratic Party by doing so are not their fault, not their problem, and ought not be their concern. Democrats' constant calls for conciliation, compromise, and concession are what got us to the point where this uprising became so necessary in the first place. Their choice for the presidential nominee this time around is an affirmation of their continued commitment to abject failure. The courage to defy them is the courage it takes to win, and the protesters are proving that every day. And if these protests can swing over, and I'm not explaining it, but I'm just hopeful if everybody gets involved, including Republicans, that if these protests could swing over into poor people's marches, then it would become a populist movement extraordinaire. And imagine what the pearl clutchers would say about that. Oh, because then instead of defund the police, you're talking about defunding the pearl clutchers. That will be a good day if it ever happens.